morning. Today we are going to begin with Michael Ondaatje's celebrated novel The English Patient, which won the Booker Prize for the best novel in 1992. The film was adapted for an Academy Award winning movie also. I am sure most of you are familiar with this, starring Ray Fiennes and Juliette Binoche and William Dafoe, directed by Anthony Minghella. So, the movie is set during the Second World War, and the exact location is a place called Villa San Girolamo in Tuscany, Italy. I will read the epilogue. Epilogue is the way writers begin generally their works, and just to set the tone of the work. And we are told that this excerpt is taken from the minutes of the Geographical Society meeting of November 1947, London. So, it begins like this. Most of you, I am sure, remember the tragic circumstances of the death of Geoffrey Clifton at Gulf Kabir, followed later by the disappearance of his wife Catherine Clifton, which took place during the 1939 desert expedition in search of Zerzura. I cannot begin this meeting tonight without referring very sympathetically to those tragic occurrences. The lecture this evening, ellipsis. Now, what does it tell you? The very epilogue tells us that we are going to encounter two characters, Catherine and Geoffrey Clifton. Geoffrey died during a desert expedition. So, we now know that this is a novel which is primarily set in the deserts of particularly of North Africa, and in search of Zerzura. Perhaps this is the name of a particular desert, and Geoffrey Clifton, who is an expert cartographer or a geologist, he along with his wife perished tragically in 1947 November. Yes, sorry, not in exactly 1947, but during the war, during the expedition, during in 1939. So, this is a tragic affair that is recalled and remembered. So, the English Patient has got lots to do with the idea of memory, and we have just finished The Remains of the Day, which is another novel about, if you remember, Mr. Stevens, who recalls most of his life set during the years between the First and the Second World War. So, that is a novel of memory, and so is The English Patient. So, remembering two dead people who just disappeared in one of the desert expeditions in 1939. Okay, so this epilogue sets the tone of the novel. It is a novel of loss, it is a novel of death. It is also a novel about people who live in exile in faraway lands, not in their own lands, because the very construct of identities and nationalities is interrogated in The English Patient. So, these are the key words that we will be looking at: memory, death, loss, identities. English Patient is the most famous work of Michael Ondaatje's, and it is extremely lyrical in style. The novel's principal themes are continuation of themes that appeared in two of Ondaatje's earlier works, and we will be talking about those earlier works soon. The characters in the English Patient, Count Almasi, and Count Almasi is the English Patient. I am giving away the suspense right at the beginning, at the introduction of the novel. Count Almasi is the English Patient, who is not an English man, he is a Hungarian. Okay. So, as we were talking about just now, the very construct of identities is challenged. The English patient is not exactly English, that is the idea. Then we have a French Canadian nurse, Hannah. We have a spy, a Canadian spy, Caravaggio, and he is also an interesting character. We have an Indian Sikh called Kripal Singh, but who has abbreviated his name to Kip. And we have of course Catherine Clifton and Geoffrey Clifton, husband and a wife, who died in 1939, and they are mentioned at the very beginning in the epilogue. And another very important character is Villa San Girolamo, where the action takes place. Okay. So now the Villa is also an extremely important character. Michael Ondate, who was born in 1943, wrote another important works earlier to the English Patient. One is the Dainty Monsters, 1967, and the collected works of Billy the Kid, left-handed poems. It was written in 1970. So, 1967, the Dainty Monsters, the collected works of Billy the Kid, 1970. So, like these two works, the English Patient also explores the themes of love, memory, exile, death, the conflicted sense of national identity, the political and moral dangers of complicity with the ruling elite, something that we found in The Remains of the Day also in a very understated manner. The English Patient is also concerned with the fiery intensity of love, along with the postmodernist sense of history as a function of perspective, the tension between creative and destructive energy, and most importantly the many manifestations of the so called outsider. So, as we were talking about it in the beginning, English Patient is also a novel about identities. Okay. Who is an outsider, who is the other, and who is the insider, and who belongs. So, the very construct of identities is extremely fluid. Who is what, we do not know. So, that is also perceptible in the way the novel is structured or constructed, because there are several gaps, and gaps is an important aspect of the many pleasures of reading the English Patient. So, we have to understand what are these literary gaps and how do they accentuate the literary pleasure of reading the English Patient. We will be talking about that soon. Stylistic conventions. Now, stylistic conventions that emerge in the English Patient appeared first in Ondate's poetry. Remember, Ondate is also a renowned poet, an acclaimed poet, besides being an award-winning novelist. So, the stylistic conventions that are most obvious, one is fragmentation. The novel is fragmented, it is broken, but that adds to its pleasure. Okay. It also has the kind of action that we found in Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day, that the action is non-linear, it moves back and forth in time, because after all it is a novel of about memory. We have several interruptions and intrusions in the story, and subversion of absolutely any kind of linear narration. We do not know how the characters go back while they are in conversation at one point of time, at a particular time and at a particular place, and suddenly with one swish of memory they are transported to a totally different place and time. So, complete subversion of the linear way of storytelling or narration. Shifting narrative points of view is also an important aspect of the English Patient. we have also seen how point of view is an integral part of any narrative. In the remains of the day, we noticed how the entire story unfolds through the perspective or through the point of view of Mr. Stevens, the butler. But here we find that there are several points of view. We have Caravaggio's point of view, of course we have the English patient's point of view, who is the hero of the novel, the so called hero of the novel. We have Hannah's point of view, and we have Kripal's perspective also, Kip's perspective on things. So, there are multiple perspectives, and each perspective adds to a specific dimension of the novel. Blending of the genre is another recurring stylistic convention in the works of Michael Ondaatje, and one thing is that you never know how to read the book. I will give you the titles of the chapters, and it tells you, it may give you a glimpse about the various kind of the titles itself themselves give you an overview of how difficult it is to define the genre of the English patient. Genre is a category, of course we all know that genre is a category. We have several kinds of genres in literature. We have a romantic genre of novel writing, we have an adventurous novel, we have a detective or spy novel where the hero is a spy. We also have love stories, we have family novels, okay, we have adventurous novels, but it is very difficult to pigeonhole in any the English patient in any particular category. So, the contents or the chapters go like the villa that we were just talking about, Villa San Girolamo, in near ruins. Okay, so this is in near ruins itself is a very deceptive title. Okay, what exactly is in near ruins? Is it the villa? Is it the life of any particular character, or maybe the world falling apart? Because remember, this is a world this is a story which took place during the Second World War. So, a world, an entire way of life, civilization going asunder. Sometime a fire. Okay, what exactly? South Cairo 1930 to 1938. So, perhaps that period is extremely important, 1930 to 1938. But remember, in 1939 is the time when Geoffrey Clifton died along with his wife. So, whatever happened between 1930 to 1938 must have been extremely important. Catherine, and an entire chapter devoted to Catherine. The title is, she must be so important to some of the characters that we have. Then we have a full length chapter dedicated to her. It is her name that figures, and talking about names, names form an integral part of the English patient. As we saw, even the title itself is so intriguing, the English patient. Okay. So, a nameless entity, what is he called? And names are an important aspect of the English patient. I will read out a couple of paragraphs, and that will perhaps substantiate what I am saying. A buried plain, in situ, the holy forest, the cave of swimmers, August. Now, just a mere glimpse at the titles of the chapters tell you that it is very difficult to identify the genre of the English patient, and that is what we were talking about. Let us also talk about the idea of names, because names are a vital aspect of our identities. All of us get recognized by our names. We are known by our names. Names qualify us, but here the construct of names are extremely, what Ondate does is deal with the romance of names, deal with the glamour of names, and you find names all over the novel. The entire novel is full of names of people, of books, of even winds and deserts and places, and every name has something significant. Every name has something significant, aspect to it. So, this is how the novel begins, very intriguingly. She stands up in the garden where she has been working and looks into the distance. She has sensed a shift in the weather. There is another gust of wind, a buckle of noise in the air, and the tall cypresses sway. She turns and moves uphill towards the house, climbing over a low wall, feeling the first drops of rain on her bare arms. She crosses the loggia and quickly enters the house. In the kitchen, she does not pause, but goes through it and climbs the stairs which are in darkness, and then continues along the long hall, at the end of which is a wedge of light from an open door. She turns into the room, which is another garden, this one made up of trees and bowers painted over its walls and ceiling. The man lies on the bed, his body exposed to the breeze, and he turns his head slowly towards her as she enters. Now, so much of detailing, how she walks, how the woman walks, how she goes across the length and breadth of the place, but we are not told who she is and what's her, more importantly, what exactly is her name. And he lies on the bed, but we don't know who he is. Okay. His body is exposed to the breeze and he looks at her, he watches her. So, so much of pronouns, but no absolute disdain rather for names, but names are very important here. A word about Michael Ondate. Michael Ondate was born in Sri Lanka in 1943. His parents, Mervyn Ondate and Doris, were prominent members of the inhabitants of what once comprised the Ceylonese colonial society. Mervyn Ondate was a tea and rubber plantation engineer, supervisor, and Doris, Ondate's mother, performed part time as a radical dancer. So, a very interesting mix of parents. Father is a supervisor for the tea and rubber plantation, mother is kind of a performing artist. His parents separated in 1954 and he along with his mother, brother and sister migrated first to England and later moved to Canada. So, Michael Ondate is basically known today as a Canadian writer. So, Canadian post-colonialism is something that we have to look at while doing the English Patient. Ondate received his Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Toronto in 1965 and his master's degree from the Queen's University in 1967, and then he also taught for a number of years at various universities in Canada. So, the English Patient is a continuation of an earlier Ondate novel, In the Skin of a Lion, which was published in 1987, which first introduces us to the character of David Caravaggio, who is the master spy in the English Patient. So, a sense of continuity, from of characters from one novel to another. It is a very postmodernist aspect also. If you remember in one of our earlier lectures on postmodernism, we talked about how characters from one novel appear or emerge in another novel of the writer. So, a very postmodernist technique adds a sense of intertextuality and a sense of continuation. So, Michael Ondaatje started his career with writing poems, and his first poem, as we were just talking about, was Dainty Monsters. Also notice how he juxtaposes to very opposing images in his very first literary work, Dainty Monsters, and as a result explores some very seemingly incongruous elements and ideas, a trait that is common to most of his works. He has also written a serial poem, The Man with Seven Toes, in 1969, and this was inspired by paintings by an Australian artist, which was about a true story of a woman living among the aborigines after a shipwreck. So, this interest in historical narratives, fragmented narratives and visual arts also has become a signature style in most of in Ondaatje's writing. Both the collection of poems, the collected works of Billy the Kid, and his first novel, Coming Through Slaughter, 1976, they were inspired by films, photographs, historical fragments, as well as oral legends, many of which are included in the final published works. In The Skin of a Lion, in which we saw that the character of David Caravaggio appears, and also his first novel. It takes place in Toronto within the Macedonian immigrant community. So, look at the common ideas and themes that interconnect most of his works, the idea of exile, immigration, this blurring of boundaries and identities, okay. Perhaps a reflection on his own life, on his own identity. Okay. Michael Ondaatje relies heavily on historical documentation for inspiration, weaving it into a kind of a fictional story. Two characters from the novel Turn Up Again, from In the Skin of the Lion, they turn up again in The English Patient, so which is another story based on historical archives. After all, it is a novel which was set during the Second World War, and during the course of his historical research on that, they also relied heavily on true incidents. Of course, it is a fictional narrative, but he interweaves fiction with historical facts. In 1982, he published his a fictional kind of a biography of his childhood in Ceylon. It was called Running in the Family, and he uses plenty of oral history of his family to try and reconstruct his family's past. After The English Patient, Ondaatje's next major work was Anil's Ghost, which was published in the year 2000, set amidst the civil war in Sri Lanka during the late 1980s and the early 1990s. So, according to Ondaatje, the conflict in the island has three sides: the government side, the anti-government insurgents, and the separatists, the guerrillas. And the story focuses on the character of its heroine, very mysteriously called Anil. Anil usually is a boy's name, a man's name. In 2007, Ondaatje published Divisadero, a novel which maps the lives of three characters through their journeys across California of the 1970s, San Francisco of the 1990s, and the present day France. So, again notice the preoccupation with traveling across space and time, okay, the sheer blurring of boundaries, okay, the idea of travel, journey, exile and immigration. Divisadero is influenced by the literary styles of Joseph Conrad and Kawabata, the Japanese writer. Ondate has also done short movies, plays and photography. So, again uh, uh, to just do a quick recap, most of his themes deal with the constructs of identity. Among the post-colonial feminist and race theorists of the 1980s and 1990s, there is an increasing concern with the relationship between literature and the larger socio-political contexts within which it develops. We are familiar with theorists like Edward Said, who wrote the seminal work Orientalism, and also the works of Gayatri Chakravarti, Spivak and Homi Bhabha. So, these theories postulate that English culture exists not simply as a representation of elegance and higher culture, but also as a reflection of a massive enterprise of hegemonic influence and self validation of the colonizing elites. And this is something that was also referred to not exactly as a post colonial work, but if you look at the kind of dominance that the ruling class or the kind of control that the ruling class and the elite people exert over the so called smaller people, then this idea was explored in great depth and detail in The Remains of the Day as well. Okay, as we were talking about it when we were reading the novel, that it need not be The Remains of the Day need not be a novel about races per se, but it is also about how human beings control one another, how they exert certain kind of authority and power over those who are powerless, and thus rendering them completely almost impotent. The English Patient also is very, if when we read the English Patient, we cannot ignore the post-colonial theory, and post-colonial theory of course is concerned with examining the mechanisms and processes through which the colonizing powers persuaded the colonized to accept a foreign culture as something which is better than their own native way of living. So, post-colonial theorists focus on the discourse as an articulation of voices of those who were formerly colonized. Here we come across the very popular term, the binaries. The term binary, which means the exact opposite of a particular term, for example, black and white, good and evil, savage and civilized. So, Edward Said in Orientalism describes at length that the West's construction of the Orient, the so called East, it projects all the things that the West considers negative. So, this means that all the things on the, when we talk about a slash, the binaries. So, on the right hand side of the slash exist in a binary opposition to whatever exists in the Orient. So, the Orient becomes the place where body as opposed to the mind exists, evil and not good, ignorance as opposed to enlightenment, and feminine as opposed to the masculine, they reside. So, by juxtaposing all these negatives on the Orient, Said, according to Edward Said, the West positions itself as infinitely better or superior and positive. So, one of the major concerns of the English Patient is also exploration of these so called binaries. Canadian literature of course is heavily influenced by the post colonial theory. So, if some of you who are interested in that particular area can look it up. In Canadian literature, as it true of the most literature from the former colonies, the idea of the nation, what constitutes a nation, exerts a powerful influence in the context of particularly in the context of globalization. The problematic histories and political functions of literary nationalism assume new meaning and urgency. So, Canadian literature remains a vital site where we can locate discussions of complex socio-political relations. One of the major aspects of we were just talking about the idea of post colonialism, and then the romance of names in the English patient, and also very interestingly it deals with the idea of body. Okay, so various bodies are described at length. Okay, so in cultural studies we look at the construct of bodies. What do bodies mean to ourselves and to other people? How do people perceive bodies? And here, I was just reading it to you. The man lies on the bed, his body exposed to the breeze, and he turns his head slowly towards her as she enters. Every 4 days she washes his black body, beginning at the destroyed feet. She wets a washcloth and holding it above his ankles squeezes the water onto him. Looking up as he murmurs, seeing his smile, above the shins the burns are worst, beyond purple bone. She has nursed him for months and she knows the body well. Hip bones of Christ, she thinks, he is her despairing saint. He lies flat on his back, no pillow, looking up at the foliage painted onto the ceiling, its canopy of branches, and above that blue sky. So, look how tenderly the body of a burnt man is described. So, we have the woman, the place is, the setting is Villa San Girolamo in Tuscany, Italy. We have a woman looking after a burnt man, a severely burnt man who is so destroyed, so damaged that he cannot even move. For his basic necessities also he needs the help of this woman. So, who is this woman? We are not told their names so far. So, this woman is Hannah, a French Canadian nurse who cares for a single patient. So, she is a nurse by profession and she is attending to the needs of a severely burnt patient, which we have just seen. And neither he is so badly burnt that one cannot recognize his face or his identity or his nationality. Okay, he is absolutely burnt. So, but it could also be a metaphor for doing away with the constraints of all physical boundaries, because after all the English patient is also about exploration, about cartography, about maps and territories, and also about national and personal identities. So, by making the hero a totally burnt character, so badly burnt that one cannot even ascertain his nationality, Michael Ondate is perhaps driving home a particular point. Most people believe in the villa that this man, this burnt man is an Englishman. However, he is not English at all. His real name is Count Laszlo de Almasi. He is a Hungarian, a member of the Royal Geographical Society, which is a group of cartographers who create maps of the North Africa desert, especially shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War. So, Count Almasi is not an Englishman, he is a Hungarian cartographer, but he has managed to blur or conceal his identity so well that no one can make out that he is not an Englishman. So, Hannah, the woman that we just looked at, she is a nurse and she has seen vast human destruction. She also had a string of her own personal problems that we will be looking at, but at the moment we find her dealing with patients and she has seen severely damaged bodies, people who would die within an hour of getting admitted in the hospital. So, she has tended to them. She has witnessed as a nurse during combat the specific war related deaths of several of her own near and dear people. Okay. She is just 20 years old, and she remembers soldiers coming to her in bits and pieces. That is Ondate's sentence, Ondate's line, falling in love with her just for an hour or so before dying. So, she is a lovable person, she is kind and generous, she is extremely maternal, just 20, but she embodies everything which is maternal, compassionate and kind, and people fall in love with her, including the English patient. But um, so severely damaged is Hannah because of her personal tragedies that it takes a while for her to recognize love when it comes. So, coming to Hannah, as the war nears its end, Hannah welcomes the solace that she finds in taking care of a single patient, that is our English patient, in the quietude of Villa San Girolamo. So, it is here that the English patient who comes to trust Hannah starts confiding in her and slowly unravels his personal history or personal story, which he had never ever told anyone before. So, we have to remember that English patient is a burnt man, is also under the influence of heavy doses of morphine, which Hannah administers to him periodically to allay his pain. And so, his narration is a non-linear, intermittent and full of gaps. So, these fragmented narratives, these fragmented stories make up for the story of the English patient. The narrative, the entire narrative covers almost 7 years, as we had just seen, 1930 to 38, and it is constructed and reconstructed from the ever shifting multiple points of view. So, what do we see here? We find discussions of nationalities and identities which are interconnected in the English patient, functioning together to create a web of structures that tie the characters to certain places and time, despite their best efforts to evade such constraints. For example, Count Almazy, he all his life he had been desperately trying to elude the forces of nationality, so much that he prefers to live in a desert, live a life of a scholar, a cartographer, and almost blurring his identity. No one could ever make out that he is not an Englishman, and this is something that he has chosen to do. Okay, this is how he forges his identity through his works and through his interactions with other people. So, this is not the identity which he has inherited, he has chosen this identity. And the environment in the novel, the descriptions are such in the novel that they add to the idea, they lend credence to the idea that national identities can indeed be erased. So, in a way this is an argument, the entire novel is an argument for erasing these man-made boundaries. I will take you to page 116, sorry, page 16, where what happens to names and what happens to as well as what happens to identities, how fragile they are and how they can be consumed at any moment, and this idea is given very beautifully on page 16. He describes the winds. Okay, he is an explorer. His specialty is cartography of deserts, and here we find him describing the desert winds. So, look at the names and look at also the preoccupation with the identities that come along with the names. There is a whirlwind in southern Morocco, the Ajij, against which the Fellahin defend themselves with knives. There is the Africo, which has at times reached into the city of Rome. So, there is this desert wind which comes from somewhere in Africa and which can reach Rome. So, you see this desert which has this wind which comes from Africa, which has an Arabic name and it reaches Rome. So, what makes for an identity? How do you define boundaries? That is the question. The Alm, a fall wind out of Yugoslavia, the Arifi, also Christian Arif or Rifi, which scorches with numerous tongues. These are permanent winds that live in the present tense. So, these are those winds that are still going on and these names still survive. There are others, less constant winds that change direction, that can knock down horse and rider and realign themselves anti-clockwise. The Bistros leaps into Afghanistan for 170 days, bearing villages. So, you see national identities can be erased. Such is the force and power of these winds arising from the deserts of Africa. They reach Afghanistan, they reach Rome, and in Afghanistan they can bury villages. And what happens to the identities of those villages and the people? There is the hot, dry Ghibli from Tunis, which rolls and produces a nervous condition. The Haboob, a Sudan dust storm that dresses in bright yellow walls 1,000 meters high and is followed by rain. The Harmattan, which blows and eventually drowns itself into the Atlantic. Imbat, a sea breeze in North Africa. Some winds that just sigh towards the sky. Night dust storms that come with the cold. The Kamsin, a dust in Egypt from March to May, named after the Arabic word for 50. Blooming for 50 days, the ninth plague of Egypt. The datu out of Gibraltar, which carries fragrance. There is also and there is a big blank. Okay, there is no name. So, we do not know the identity of this wind, and it is the secret wind of the desert, whose name was erased by a king after his son died within it. So, name has been erased, but you can't erase the wind, you see. So, the name the wind may not bear a name. It has been a dictator, a king, a ruler has the power to erase names, but to erase the so called surface identities, but you cannot erase the inherent force of nature. So, the wind exists, although it exists namelessly. And the Nafhat, a blast out of Arabia. The Mesorifolucin, a violent and cold southwesterly known as Berbers, as that which plucks the fowls. The Beshaber, a black and dry northeasterly out of the Caucasus. Black wind. The Samiel from Turkey, poison and wind, used often in battle, as well as the other poison winds, the Simum of North Africa and the Solano, whose dust plucks off rare petals causing giddiness. Other private winds, traveling along the ground like a flood, blasting off paint, throwing down telephone poles, transporting stones and statue heads. The Hamatan blows across the Sahara filled with red dust, dust as fire, entering and coagulating in the locks of rifles. Mariners call this red wind the sea of darkness. Red sand fogs out of the Sahara were deposited as north as Cornwall and Devon, producing showers of mud. So great, this was also mistaken for blood. Blood rains were widely reported in Portugal and Spain in 1901. There are also always millions of tons of dust in the air, just as there are millions of cubes of air in the earth and more living flesh in the soil. Worm, beetles, underground creatures, Then there is grazing and existing on it. Herodotus records the death of various armies engulfed in the Simum who were never seen again. One nation was so enraged by this evil wind that they declared war on it and marched out in full battle array, only to be rapidly and completely interred. Dust storms in three shapes: the whirl, the column, the sheet. In the first, the horizon is lost. In the second, you are surrounded by waltzing winds. The third, the sheet, is copper tinted. Nature seems to be on fire. So, various faces of the nature. Okay, nature, not just the calm, the placid one, but also its violent and destructive aspect. Everything exists and coexists with names, and sometimes it may not have names, but still it has the power, it has the force. Environment is also such that it can engulf identities and erase nations and engulf its people. So, then what constitutes identities? The question remains. The importance of the Villa San Girolamo is also important because the place also functions as a site where national identities are unimportant as people connect to each other. For example, Kip, the Sikh from India who has been participating in the war, he so becomes enmeshed in the idea of Western society that for a long time he becomes oblivious to his own identity. Count Almazy, as we have already seen, he has no sense of identity or national identity as well. And then of course, we have Hannah who considers herself a global citizen rather than a French Canadian person. So, these ideas recur, okay, they sort of form a leitmotif in the structure of the English patient. So, while we were talking about the constructs of body, you have the erased, damaged body of Count Almazy, which has erased all signs and symbols of any identity. We have Kip, who bears his his religious identity quite well. He is a Sikh, so all the hallmarks and all the defining features are there, but still he considers himself more of a Westerner than a person from anywhere else. Okay. So, his dark and lit body also becomes a subject of discussion, especially for Hannah. And then we have the willowy body of Catherine. So, her body, that too is a site for which is extremely significant and monumental. Okay. So, these are the ideas that we will be, or these are the themes that we will be looking at in greater detail and greater depth when we continue with our discussion of the English patient in the next class. Thank you very much.